Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Joining me today are Doctors Yael Rothman and Katia Fredriksen. They are both pediatric neuropsychologists in Maryland who specialize in comprehensive evaluations for children, adolescents, and young adults with a wide range of conditions that impact learning, behavior, and social emotional functioning. They recently published their first book, Different Thinkers, ADHD, and they are here with me today.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, Doctors Rothman and Fredriksen. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having us.
I am so glad to have you both here. And I was saying before we jumped on the call that it's very rare that I get we have three neuropsychologists on a call for a podcast. So this is very exciting for me.
And for us. A neuropsych party. Yes.
Yes.
And, I was really excited to have you both on because you wrote this really great book, Different Thinkers, ADHD, and which, unlike other books that are written for parents or for professionals, this book was really written for elementary age children and their families to share. Why was it important for you to write this particular book?
So, and you know this as well, when we work with families and their children, we are always giving resources for them to look to understand, explain diagnoses, how the child thinks and learns best. And there was a piece missing here from what we wanted to provide for the families. A book for the kids to understand how their brain works and how they think and learn best. And there are great materials out there for children, but they focus on symptoms, maybe excessive talking, invading personal space, but not specifically on diagnoses. And we really wanted this resource, so we decided to create it ourselves. And it was a really awesome process because both Katia and I do believe how important it is for a child to get the feedback and to hear about how their brain works so they can become their best self-advocates and be able to challenge any misconceptions that might come with having a different thinking brain as well.
And that is so important for parents to understand that kids need to understand their brains. They need to understand their diagnosis. And I had a conversation with another psychologist and we were talking about how many parents keep the diagnosis a secret from their kids. It's like, we don't want them to know that they have ADHD or dyslexia, or whatever the diagnosis might be. But it seems that your book really empowers young readers to better understand their ADHD diagnosis. And then they're well positioned, like you say, to be able to combat some of those myths and misconceptions and become better self-advocates.
That is our hope. I wonder if that was our friend, Dr. Liz, who spoke with you about that. We have been, she wrote a lovely review for us for our book as well. I think we are completely in the same mindset about how important it is for a child to understand what's going on because they are so much more self-aware than we give them credit for. Katia, would you like to add to that?
Well, this idea that we don't necessarily realize how much kids realize, right? In terms of noticing that they're having difficulties in a certain area, or so-and-so in my class can do XYZ better than I can, or whatever it is. And just how quick kids can be to develop these unfortunate negative self-attributions related to that. We'd much rather that they understand hey, we all have strengths and weaknesses. Here are some things that are harder for me. When you put those things together, that means I have ADHD. Then that they think, oh, well, I'm just never going to be good at math, or I'm just not a good kid. I don't behave right, or whatever it is. We'd much rather there were an accurate and kinder sort of explanation for the difficulties that they are 9 times out of 10 aware of, even if they don't necessarily come home and talk about it.
And, you referenced Dr. Liz Angoff, and she talks about that specifically. And I love that we're having these conversations in the professional community, but then also, using that information to really inform how we share this information with parents and help them to be more empowered. Now, I'd love for you to answer, for both of you to answer this question about why it's important. And I'm thinking about parents who might be listening and who haven't told their kids that they have ADHD or are on the fence about telling them. Why is it important for children to learn about their diagnosis? Let's talk about ADHD specifically.
So I would say that the first piece of it is what we just said, is that your child knows something's going on, right? And I think that is this misconception perhaps parents have about, oh, I'm giving them a label now. And there's this worry that this will cause a negative feeling within a child. Now we're having to put a word to what they're experiencing. When we know that really the labels they're giving themselves are so much harsher, so much more negative than they have to be. And if we could instead explain their brain, their developmental process, how being a different thinker can be a gift as well, and how we all have strengths and challenges, that is such a more effective path for this child and their future. We also, I'm sure you've seen in your office as well, adolescents who have had their diagnoses hidden from them in early childhood. And then they find out later as a 16, 17, 18-year-old. And it becomes a really frustrating identity crisis. Like, why didn't I know about this earlier? This could have explained everything for me. I always thought I was X, and replace that with whatever negative self-attribution. I always thought I was lazy or stupid or whatever upsetting word you could put there. And it's so important for these young people to hear about that, how their brain works.
Yes. And there can also be some anger when you talk about those feelings that particularly adolescents might feel, when their parents have kept this diagnosis or this information from them. And Katia, you mentioned, some misconceptions like, oh, I'll never be good at math. That's a misconception for people who have ADHD, for kids who have ADHD. I'll never be able to pay attention. And what are some other misconceptions that children, adolescents might have about their ADHD? Because I think one of the things your book does, it really strips away those stigmas and myths that people have about what it means to have ADHD.
Right, absolutely. And there are a number of these sorts of misconceptions that come up on a daily basis when we're meeting with parents. And we really, as you know, being in the same field, part of what our job is to provide psychoeducation and just to sort of give people the real information, sort of the empirically supported information, as opposed to things they may have heard or been exposed to growing up that's now outdated and inaccurate. So one of the things, a common misconception I would say, is just this idea that, because my kid can actually pay attention really nicely to certain things, it means that they can't have ADHD, because doesn't ADHD stand for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? And if there's a deficit, then how is it that, little Jimmy, who loves to spend hours on art projects, could have ADHD, right? And so we have to have that conversation around, well, that's because little Jimmy loves art. He's good at art. He feels good about it. He's in his wheelhouse, right? As opposed to when his teacher gives him his homework and they're, maybe perceived as boring, challenging, stressful. And then those skills are much more difficult to implement. So that's something that comes up and we regularly talk about.
That's definitely a very common one that comes through our office. Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's like a general misconception about ADHD. And And then the other one that often comes to mind, I just had I feel like I have a weekly conversation about this, is that doesn't everybody have ADHD?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We were just talking about this, and we were discussing how this isn't specific, I don't think, to ADHD. I feel like a lot of people will use DSM diagnoses and say like, oh, I have a touch of OCD, or I have a bit here. And it is really complicated, because it is 100% true that the average human experience is that our attention levels will wax and wane. I mean, that is how we all experience the world. And then when you think about an ADHD brain, about how it really is difficult to navigate the world when things are not stimulating and motivating and interesting to them. And you don't want to remove that experience from someone who's having this challenge. So it's hard. We don't want to take away from somebody who's having the clinical significant challenges and just say we all have a touch of ADHD. The answer is we all have attention variability. I mean, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. I like to think about it, as so many things. It's a spectrum, right? I mean, we all, and certain, a certain degree of something can be a positive, like anxiety, for example. A certain degree of anxiety is positive. It keeps us safe. We think twice before we walk down the dark alley, We don't stand quite so close to the edge of the subway platform, things like that, right? So a touch of something can be protective, but it's when it veers into a realm where it's having a negative impact on your life, and that's what the diagnostic manual states. I mean, you don't make a diagnosis unless we've reached that sort of territory. I just tend to think everything's on a spectrum.
Yes. And I think that makes sense to a lot of parents, a lot of people, is that, your child is having more difficulty than their peers at navigating some of these expectations at school and at home. And it can lead to a great deal of distress when you're not able to keep up, you're not able to manage your attention, you're getting in trouble at school, those kinds of things. And you're not able to apply all of your intellectual functioning and the things that you know in your daily experience. And that can be incredibly frustrating.
Well, and I think that's why standardized tests and questionnaires are so useful, because it gives us an opportunity to look at, well, this 8-year-old male relative to other 8-year-old males, lo and behold, this is actually developmentally appropriate. Or, as a matter of fact, other teachers of children of this age and gender are not reporting this degree of difficulty. This is actually something related to this child's development. That sort of thing, I think, really helps sort of put these things in context.
That's really helpful. And, one of the things you both talk about and I talk about is the importance of understanding their brains. I just think it's so important I think it's important for everyone to understand their brains, but kids need to understand their amazing brains. And in your book, you also discuss how the brain develops and what that means for individuals with ADHD and their brains. Why is it important for you to kind of make that connection from not only the behaviors that you see, and you talk about a lot of books focus on symptoms, to focusing on the differences in the ways our brains are wired?
I think that comes from our background. All being pediatric neuropsychologists, we really discuss neurodevelopment all the time, and how important it is to understand that things change over time as well, especially with ADHD being such a awesome discussion here about the prefrontal cortex and how it's still developing and growing. And I think kids find that fascinating, that their brain is still processing information and grow and changing over time. And how we talk about how it's moving at a rate that's a little slower than some of your classmates might be moving in these areas of development. And then you also have things that your classmates can't do and your beautiful strengths that go along with that. But I think it's so important for them to know that they're still a work in progress. They're still building these skills, and they they can build these skills and learn how to support their challenges.
I appreciate those points.
I'm glad.
Just as well, right? I was trying to, because saying I also think could mean that I'm trying to, say something counter, but no, I'm just adding on. I also think that it's useful because it gives us, because a lot of people agonize about causality of whatever the concern is, right? There can be a lot of, the famed mommy guilt, parenting guilt around, have I made my child, have I parented in such a way, or did I not get enough of the omega-3s when I was pregnant, or whatever it is, people tend to go down these pathways. And so, just the idea of, actually, this is just part of how your kid's brain is developing. It's not that you didn't sleep train them at the right age, or, let's just sort of walk back those pieces where people sort of start attributing this unnecessary sort of negative feeling and guilt. A, and B, it also gets to the idea of the can't do versus won't do. So in other words, again, if we're thinking of this as related to neurological development, which is maybe not progressing at the quote unquote typical rate, then, it's much easier to take that view of, oh, well, my kid is struggling with this because this is actually an area of actual difficulty, as opposed to my kid's being a pain in the behind and sort of not trying hard enough. And so that sort of change of perspective can make a world of difference to parenting strategies and result in things that are much more productive.
And that really changes the narrative about, ADHD, but it also opens up the conversation about neurodiversity in general when we think about it as differences in the way as our brains are wired.
Definitely. And we hope that it educates professionals as well. I don't know how many times you've talked to teachers who kind of need a reframe about how this young person is taking in information in the classroom. And I've had to talk about how this is brain-based difficulties. Again, can't versus won'ts.
And that brings to my attention one of the things that we know when we do these assessments and do these evaluations and we identify these strengths and these areas of challenge for many of the kiddos, that we also know that they're going back to, many of them are going back to traditional school environments. And you both say that the world was not built for different thinkers. And that's such an important message for most people to understand, is that the world is built for certain types of thinkers and it wasn't built for different thinkers. What does it mean to be a different thinker?
So I think about different thinkers and I think about the term neurodiversity. We talk about how neurodiversity is this range of differences that naturally occurs in our brain as part of a normal variation in the human population. So there's this phrasing like neurodiversity is to human culture as biodiversity is to the ecosystem. So we need neurodiversity, right? It's not something that means that you're interacting with the world in a wrong way, an abnormal way. There isn't a right, wrong here. But it is about a different way of thinking and experiencing the world around you. And that can come in many different ways. That could be how you take in sensory information, how you take in language, how you understand social or emotional cues. But in ADHD, we think about how it is for what is around regulation and what gets you interested and stimulated here as well.
It makes me think too about, as we're thinking in terms of a concrete example about being a different thinker, right? It makes me think about what we expect of students these days in sort of kindergarten, first grade. I mean, we all sort of reflect back, well, when I was in kindergarten, we just ran around and played, and wasn't that right. The life? Like, don't you wish you could go back to kindergarten kind of thing? And I mean, we know that that's actually what kids really should be doing. That's the sort of learning that's best for them at that age in terms of their neurological development and just their socio-emotional functioning, right? And yet here we are these days, and obviously school settings vary, but just with this higher emphasis on the early academic development and the self-regulation in terms of being sitting still and not poking other people and having less in the way of recess and all of those sorts of things, right? And so I mean, I would argue that that's not necessarily ideal for any child. But again, particularly if you're a different thinker and some of these skills are emerging later. So that's an example of where there can be this sort of poor fit, like square peg, round hole scenario, right? For a child because of their different thinking brain, which can ultimately end up being a beautiful thing, but in the moment can make it harder for them to do the things that they're expected to do.
Right. And it's about balancing the challenges that they face in a world where these expectations are continuing to increase. Now we're forcing phonological processing on kindergartners when before there's a lot of sand play and focus on social emotional skills. We've taken out PE out of a lot of schools, or at least reduced the amount of time that children spend in gym, 2 days a week as opposed to every day. And we know that exercise is so important for brain function. And, you talk about the beauty of having ADHD and aspects of having ADHD. And I think that's the important thing that you both emphasize as well, is that we are aware of the challenges that are associated with ADHD. But at the same time, it's equally important for young people to realize the beauties that they have within them, the talents that they have, their strengths, their interests and abilities. And why is that balance so important?
I think that when we discuss a different thinker, we think about how being able to see outside of the box actually is a beautiful thing and advances our society, right? The people who are artists, are scientists, are inventors, are likely all probably different thinkers, that they were able to do that. And for ADHD, we know that research has shown that individuals who do have ADHD tend to be more creative. We know that because of this attention variability, they can get really into their passions, which can end up being a beautiful thing. And many famous people have talked about how that propelled their careers. And the resilience and the willingness to take risks and be spontaneous actually can really work in their favor. And this can definitely help them as they get older as well.
And that really speaks to changing that narrative, right? Because oftentimes we focus on the fact that kids with ADHD can't do things. They can't focus on tasks for a long period of time. We know that's particularly when they're not interested in, but they can, like you were saying, focus on and stick with activities that are important to them. And that can be a beautiful thing. And that also speaks to the points you make in your book about making sure that kids have an opportunity to reflect on those strengths, their personal strengths. And it seems like that can be very empowering.
Absolutely. Research shows that kids with ADHD get more negative feedback than the average child. There's a lot of stop doing that, don't do that, I said not to, blah, blah, right? Even when we as parents are trying to be conscious of that, it can be difficult to inhibit it. Speaking of inhibitory control, right? And so we don't want this to become a negative term or label and a negative experience, because again, if it's to do with the child's brain, I mean, that's the essence of who they are. And so if you say your brain means you have ADHD and you don't help them understand how ADHD can be a good thing, that's not a good setup for them.
Right. And especially if they're hearing that a lot at school, like sit still, put your pencil down, stop rocking in your chair. You need to sit down,
right.
Stop talking. They're hearing a lot about what they're not doing correctly. And if they also hear that counter narrative that you're incredibly creative, oh my goodness, that you really showed your extraordinary imagination in that story you just told.
I agree.
Definitely. And we know how much our executive functioning, so the ability to inhibit, organize, attend, is connected to our emotional functioning. So it's going to be very difficult for these young people to be present if they constantly are feeling negative about who they are as well, because we all do that, right? If it's a situation that we feel anxious, overwhelmed, or sad, it's going to be really hard to be present in those settings here too. So I think that's another important part of supporting this young person.
Now, how should parents and caregivers use this book with kids? Because it's not just, you give it to them, here, read about ADHD, come back if you have any questions. How do you want them to use a book like yours?
Well, we tend to recommend that, first of all, parents, read through the book themselves and feel comfortable with the subject matter, right? If parents have lingering doubts or anxiety, worries associated with a diagnosis, whether or not they intend to, it's likely that will be conveyed when they speak about it with the child, right? So that's always an important first step, is to be sure you're comfortable with the material, you're comfortable talking about it, so that you can present it in the way that it should be presented to your child, right? So that would be a first step. And then, it's funny because we've had a number of sort of colleagues and friends and just various people who have come back and told us, oh, well, I just had the book and I left it out and my kid came along and I found my kid reading the book. So I think the fact that it has a visually sort of engaging, right, with the illustrations, I think really helps draw kids in. And then as parents sort of sit down and read through it, part of what we've tried to do is make it, add in sort of personal references, so-and-so experiences this sort of difficulty, how about you kind of thing? Like, is this something that happens to you in your life? And so those are moments to pause and sort of reflect and think about, oh, well, the other day on the playground with Jimmy, something similar happened, and you can sort of have those discussions. So we've tried to make it interactive, while giving information, also to generate discussion. And we've included at the end, a bit of a workbook to go through to reflect on, the three vignettes, the three characters we describe in the book. Here are areas of strength for them and areas that they want to work on, right? And so let's sort of pause and reflect. What are our areas of strength, our areas to work on, and then what are ways in which we might go about doing that? Here are things that helps for these characters. Maybe we could try putting up a visual schedule or whatever it is. So again, just this idea of the book engendering a discussion, as well as offering information.
And I think a lot of kids reading this book will see themselves in the characters in your book, those three characters, James, Sammy, Ella. I think they'll see themselves and feel less alone, right? That's like me. I do that too. And it lets them feel like they are not the only ones who are experiencing these struggles. And that opens, like you're saying, for a bigger discussion with their parents about, you're not the only one. There are many kids who also have trouble paying attention, but also are really creative like you.
We hope that's our goal. And also how a lot of parents might see themselves as well in some of the characters too. We know ADHD runs in families. I don't know how many times at one of your feedback sessions you've had parents say, oh, this is very much like me and what I've experienced in my life. So having a discussion about how you're also not alone in this household. We can work on this together. I need this support too.
Right. And there's something about understanding differences in the wiring of our brains, bringing that back as well. And it feels like when we do that, through looking at stories of other characters who also have differences in the wiring of our brains, maybe family members who have differences in the wiring of our brains, we celebrate differences, right? In general. And do you feel that celebrating differences makes everyone feel more included when we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, and I think as we get older, that becomes more accessible. So in other words, there's only so much range of activities and information, et cetera, that elementary school kids have access to. And so much of it is curated by their parents, right? And then as they hit middle school, high school, I know we have certainly concerns and worries about their exposure to the digital world, but it's also a means of to access good quality, obviously bad quality too, but good quality information through reliable sources, right? And so the world sort of broadens, and they can more readily access communities of people who share their strengths and weaknesses. And so that's, part of what we were hoping to do with this book. And I think I've gotten off track from your question, but I went down my own train of thought, is to sort of provide that experience for the elementary school age population, since they don't really have that access otherwise.
And we think celebrating differences is so important across the board, and talking about diversity in general. We also wanted our characters to be diverse. We wanted children to see that there are many different presentations of ADHD. We wanted the characters to come from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And this is all part of the important understanding of celebrating differences.
And I think they're just such wonderful takeaways and strategies from the book that parents and educators can use to support different thinkers, to support children with ADHD in so many aspects of their lives, at home and at school. And I just really appreciate the work that you both do, obviously, because we do the same work. But also, you took a step further. You wrote this book for parents, for educators, for children. And that is such a valuable resource for children who have ADHD, for families who have a child or themselves have ADHD. Are you going to write one that's related to dyslexia or some other learning disability as well? I'm wondering if that's coming down the pike.
Mm-hmm. That's the plan.
Our next book is aimed to focus on autism.
Okay.
And then we hope to also create some resources regarding learning disabilities and anxiety. So we're hoping for a series here that will be able to be used with a lot of different individuals who would benefit from it.
Well, and that's accessible, right?
Yes.
Just, we're conscious of the fact that we love the work that we do, but it's not accessible to everyone. Right?
That's exactly it.
And this book, so the kinds of things we talk about in the book is the kinds of things we talk about with families. And so if we can convey that information to a broader audience at, making it something they can access much more easily is really our goal.
Yeah, we had started, I guess 2 years ago now, an Instagram account to provide evidence-based information to parents and caregivers and families for the same reason, that we know that it can be information overload out there and sometimes not helpful information, and that not everyone can come to us. So we were hoping to give more information out there too.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for doing that. I am thrilled that we are connected, that we got connected. And I just want to thank you both so much for joining me today. If parents, educators, and professionals in our community want to connect with you, where can I send them?
Well, you can send them to our Instagram account for one, which is, it's a bit of a mouthful. It's at neuropsychmomdocs. We were trying to cover all the bases there. And we also have developed an email address associated with the book. It's different.thinkers.books@gmail.com.
Perfect. I'll be sure to put links in the show notes, and I'll also put a link to your book, Different Thinkers ADHD, in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. It's such a pleasure speaking with you both.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining my conversation today. Be sure to check out the show notes to learn more about Drs. Fredriksen and Rothman and their book, Different Thinkers ADHD. And if you need more support for supporting your child with ADHD, be sure to check out our mini courses. You can find a link in the show notes. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.